A marriage proposal can seem so sweet, filled with excitement, nerves, and love. A young man dropped to one knee, looked up at his girlfriend with hope, and asked her to be his wife. She accepted with joy. It would have been a perfect romantic moment if, just an hour earlier, the couple had not taken part in a bloody massacre. Viewers of the channel are encouraged to support it by liking the video, trying the new hype feature, leaving a comment, and subscribing for more stories, as this kind of engagement helps the creators. Isabella Gosling was born in 1995 and grew up in Bournemouth, United Kingdom, a coastal resort town where this case unfolded. Very little is known about her early years. She claimed that her mother was extremely cruel, but these accusations were never confirmed. At the age of 7, Isabella was diagnosed with a personality disorder and autism. Autism spectrum disorder appears differently in each person, with varying symptoms, severity, and age of onset. It is a developmental condition linked to atypical brain function and is marked by difficulties in social interaction and communication, along with restricted interests and repetitive behavior. People on the autism spectrum often struggle to connect with others, experience the world in their own way, and may behave in ways that seem unusual to most. They can appear emotionally distant and uninterested in what is happening around them, as if living in a private world. Isabella had major problems with socialization. Making friends was extremely difficult for her, and she felt isolated and lonely in everyday life. Over time, this isolation fueled intense anger. She became bitter, lashed out at those around her, and tended to push people away before they had a chance to hurt her. During her teenage years, Isabella grew into a cold and calculating manipulator. She interacted with classmates only when they could be of use to her, treating people as tools rather than individuals with feelings. Other people's emotions or problems meant nothing to her. She showed no genuine concern for anyone but herself and felt no guilt or remorse for the harm she caused. She lied constantly and moved through life, leaving confusion and damage behind, yet remained completely indifferent to the consequences. In March 2014, when Isabella was 19, she met a 1-year-old man named Philip Nicholson, and from that moment, his life began to unravel. Philip also lived in Bournemouth and was known as one of the kindest and most sincere people anyone could meet. He consistently put others' needs before his own. However, there was another important detail about him. As a child, Philip had been diagnosed with developmental delay, which affected the pace of his emotional development, willpower, and some cognitive skills such as speech, memory, and thinking. In practice, this meant he needed much more time than other children his age to reach the same developmental milestones. Philip often found it difficult to understand the world around him, which sometimes led him to become either very discouraged or, at other times, overly excited. Even so, his childhood was a happy one. His closest companion was his grandfather, who frequently took him on little trips to show him new places and help him discover the world. Philip was also deeply attached to his parents. He grew up honest, devoted, and trusting, always looking for the good in people and willing to do anything for his family. Yet this openness and innocence made it hard for him to tell the difference between someone who was truly kind and someone only pretending. Because of this, people with bad intentions, like Isabella Gosling, could take advantage of him with ease. When Philip was just over 20, he told his mother that he wanted more independence. He was still living with his parents at the time, but felt ready to stand on his own and move into a place of his own. For a family who understood his difficulties, allowing him to take this step into adult life was extremely hard. Even so, they respected his wishes and did their best to support him in everything he needed. Deep down, his parents struggled to picture how he would cope living on his own, whether he could deal with everyday challenges or stay out of trouble. At the same time, they realized that sooner or later, they would have to accept that he was an adult. Philip wanted to grow as a person, and felt he could not truly do that while his mother and father were still looking after everything for him. Before long, he moved out of his parents' house and into a small apartment in Bournemouth. He was not yet able to manage every aspect of life alone, so social services arranged regular visits from support workers. Most of the time, Philip lived quietly by himself, But these workers stopped by to check that he paid his bills, kept up with personal hygiene, could prepare simple meals, and stayed generally safe. This routine continued for several months. During this period, Philip often repeated that he wanted complete independence and that constant supervision from strangers was becoming frustrating. After some time, it was decided that he was ready to live entirely on his own. His long-held dream had finally come true. What he wanted most next was to find a girlfriend and experience his first romantic relationship. His parents warmly supported this wish. Growing up in a close, loving family, Philip imagined creating something similar for himself. He looked up to his mother and father and hoped one day to have the same kind of bond. At first, his family remained cautious. They knew how sensitive he was and worried about how he might react if a date went badly or if someone turned him down. They were also aware of how easy it was to influence him. Because of this, they tried to teach him how to respond in different social situations, make safer choices, and notice warning signs when dealing with other people. Philip even had to complete a kind of assessment to prove he was ready to begin romantic relationships on his own. He passed it with excellent results. After a while, she began insisting that he pay for little luxuries and special treats for her. Because of his childlike innocence and trusting nature, Philip saw nothing wrong with this. She was his girlfriend, after all. He had always focused on the good in people, so he overlooked any warning signs and truly did not realize he was being used for someone else's benefit. Before long, their relationship became physical. Isabella started demanding intimacy several times a day. Since Philip had no previous experience with women, he felt deeply uncomfortable and confused. He did not fully understand ideas like consent or personal boundaries. Isabella understood this very well, and she exploited his inexperience, pushing him into sexual acts he did not want. In reality, this was outright sexual abuse. The ongoing pressure began to damage his mental health. Philip developed intense anxiety and was constantly tense because Isabella kept forcing him into bed and he never knew what she would demand next. On top of that, she was harsh and aggressive. She regularly shouted at him and hurled insults. Philip soon became afraid of his own girlfriend, moving quietly around the apartment so as not to provoke her anger. All the while, Isabella focused only on her own desires and continued to do whatever she wanted. Because of his developmental challenges and complete lack of experience with communication and romance, Philip assumed all of this was normal, that this was simply how relationships worked and that such treatment was acceptable. He was convinced that Isabella, as his girlfriend, would never intentionally torment or harm him. Things continued this way for quite some time, until Isabella eventually grew tired of him. One day, she became bored and began an affair with another man, 5-year-old Richard Moore. Richard was essentially Isabella's male counterpart, just as calculating, shameless, and cruel in his manipulation of others. He felt no empathy and viewed people mainly as tools for his own benefit. This mindset was likely what drew the two of them together. Richard's background was troubled. He had spent a period of his life homeless, living on the streets. He also had a history of legal problems connected to violence. While trying to survive among other marginalized people, he frequently preyed on those who were weaker. He might steal belongings or food, hit someone, or beat them up. He was arrested at one point but was soon released, as few people were interested in dealing with issues involving the homeless. At some stage, Isabella introduced Richard to her boyfriend. From that moment, the already unhealthy relationship shifted into a twisted love triangle. It is unclear whether Philip fully understood what kind of connection existed between his girlfriend and this new man, but the three of them started spending a great deal of time together. Because of his condition, Philip did not see anything strange about this. He simply viewed Richard as a new friend, even though Richard posed a serious threat to vulnerable people like him, and Isabella was actively exploiting the situation for her own purposes. The more time they all spent together, the more Richard grew resentful and jealous of Isabella's relationship with Philip. However, Isabella constantly reassured Richard that she was only using Philip for his money and had no real feelings for him. She went even further, convincing Richard that they could both benefit from Philip's naivety and spend his money together, and that is exactly what they began to do. To make access to Philip's finances easier, Isabella suggested that they open a joint bank account. She argued that since they were in a sexual relationship, it was almost as if they were husband and wife, so sharing money was only natural. Philip, unsuspecting and eager to believe he was building a future with her, happily agreed and followed all of her suggestions. But this still was not enough for Isabella and Richard. They started taking out several loans in Philip's name, pushing him deeper and deeper into debt. Eventually, Philip's family discovered what was going on. Alarmed, they tried to warn him. They did everything they could to make him see that Isabella was not right for him, that her intentions were harmful, and that she was using and manipulating him. Philip trusted his family, so he decided to end the relationship. He told Isabella that he did not like the way she treated him and that he no longer wanted to be with her. However, as a skilled manipulator, Isabella refused to accept this. She told him outright that he could not leave her because they had been intimate. She twisted the situation, making him believe that it would be unfair and wrong for him to use her innocence and then abandon her. Philip now felt cornered. He was the kind of person who always put other people's comfort above his own well-being. He told his parents that Isabella was his girlfriend and that he wanted to look after her and stay loyal to her. He had watched his father remain devoted to his mother for many years and wanted to behave in the same way. From that point on, Philip's emotional and physical state continued to decline. The strain of his relationship with Isabella soon began to show on Philip's body. He was frequently unwell and steadily losing weight. He stopped eating properly, ignored basic self-care, and no longer bothered to shave. His hair and beard grew wild and untidy. The apartment fell into the same state he stopped cleaning, and the place became filthy and almost unlivable. Eventually, Philip's parents decided they could not stand by any longer. They saw their son physically deteriorating, fading in front of their eyes. His mother and father called a family meeting and asked social workers to get involved once more. Together, they sat down with Philip and carefully went over what was really happening in his life. It was during this conversation that Philip finally began to understand that not everyone in the world was kind or well-intentioned. His parents seemed at last to reach him. He saw the situation clearly and recognized that Isabella was not good for him at all. In that moment, he resolved to end the relationship. He told Isabella it was over and that they were no longer together. But Isabella had no intention of letting go of the walking cash machine, as she referred to him behind his back. She chose a tactic Philip was completely unprepared for. She claimed she was pregnant with his child and insisted that, because of this, they had to stay together. Philip was left in shock. He had always wanted to be a father. His bond with his own parents was very strong, and he dreamed of having the same kind of closeness with his future child. So when Isabella said she was pregnant, walking away no longer felt like an option. In his mind, they now had a responsibility to try to become a proper family for their baby. With that, Isabella got exactly what she wanted, and Philip found himself trapped in the relationship again. For several more months, this continued. While Philip happily prepared for fatherhood and looked forward to meeting his son or daughter, he fell completely under Isabella's control. He was determined to be the best partner he could be and was ready to spoil her in every way, believing it would help ensure a safe and healthy pregnancy. But the pregnancy was nothing more than another one of Isabella's manipulations. There was no baby at all. The entire story had been invented to keep a man who was willing to spend money on her from leaving. She knew that pretending to be pregnant was the one thing that would make Philip stay. Isabella was not only lying to Philip, she also deceived Richard, who believed the baby was his. He had no idea that the pregnancy was completely fake. In reality, both men were being misled, each convinced that he was the father of a child that did not exist. The lies allowed Isabella to keep full control over both Richard Moore and Philip Nicholson. In the spring of 2015, she escalated her manipulation to an even more dangerous level. She decided to turn the two men against each other and began deliberately provoking constant tension between them. Isabella openly flirted with both Philip and Richard in front of one another, feeding their jealousy until they were arguing over who loved her more. In truth, she did not genuinely care about either of them. Soon after, she invented an even more shocking lie. Isabella told Richard that Philip had assaulted her when she was 4 months pregnant. This accusation was completely false. Philip, who believed she was carrying his child, was deeply devoted to her and would never have harmed her. But Isabella claimed that Richard needed to defend her honor, and he fell for this manipulation immediately, eager to take revenge for an attack that had never happened. At first, Richard sent Philip a series of threatening text messages, warning that he would kill him if he did not stay away from Isabella. Then, his threats began to move toward action. On the 4th of May 2015, Philip went on a family trip. He and his relatives visited the Harry Potter studios in London, a day that was meant to be a rare and happy outing for the whole family together. However, throughout the excursion, Philip's phone kept lighting up with one threatening message after another from Richard. The young man spent the entire day clutching his phone, unable to ignore what he was receiving. He kept messaging back and forth, constantly distracted. Philip's parents noticed that he was glued to his phone, as if he no longer enjoyed spending time with them. As the hours passed, their son grew increasingly tense and irritable. His father eventually asked him directly what was going on and who he was texting all the time. Philip, however, pretended nothing serious was happening and brushed the questions aside with jokes. His parents could sense that something was wrong, but chose not to push further. They wanted to respect his privacy, especially because independence was what Philip had always asked for. He was an adult, after all, so they stepped back and stopped pressing him. In reality, Philip was being harassed and threatened by Richard throughout the day. Richard sent message after message, many of them disgusting and cruel. He wrote that Philip was digging his own grave and repeatedly said he would send him to the other side. These threats did not stop after that day. They continued over time. On one occasion, Philip was walking down the street when he saw Richard suddenly appear around a corner. It was not a random encounter. Richard had been waiting for him, planning to attack him right there. Fortunately, Philip spotted him in time, turned around, and ran away. He managed to jump onto a bus and get away, but he was far too frightened to get off. Terrified that Richard might still be nearby or follow him, he stayed on the same route for hours, riding in circles. At one point, Philip was so scared that he wet himself, yet even then he still refused to leave the bus to use the bathroom. Eventually, he called his mother and explained what was happening. She immediately came to his aid, met him, took him home, and helped him clean up. Now that she fully understood the situation, she once again tried to make her son see that Isabella was exploiting his kindness and that the relationship needed to end. Philip went to Isabella and told her that he would still help raise the baby, but he no longer wanted to live with her. Once again, she refused to let him go. Their situation became even more tangled. They would get back together, then break up, only to reunite again. This cycle repeated over and over. Philip endured it all, convinced he was doing the right thing for the sake of the unborn child. Isabella showed no concern about the lies she was telling or the emotional damage she was causing. She did not care about the pressure, confusion, or fear Philip was experiencing. Instead of offering comfort, she decided to torment him further for her own amusement. She created a fake profile and began sending him messages while pretending to be another girl named Emmy. Emmy wrote that she liked Philip and would be happy to go on a date with him. Because of his developmental delay, it never occurred to him that someone could make a fake account and pretend to be another person. The idea of such deception simply did not cross his mind. Although he remained fundamentally loyal to Isabella, he was already exhausted and overwhelmed by the chaos surrounding this relationship. When he read the message from another girl, Philip was overjoyed that someone else seemed to be romantically interested in him. He saw Emmy as a possible way out of his toxic relationship with Isabella, and a small ray of hope appeared in his heart. He called Emmy, but in reality it was Isabella on the line, disguising her voice so well that he did not recognize her. After their conversation, he arranged to meet Emmy at a pub. When Philip arrived for the date, there was no sign of Emmy. Instead, Isabella was there, with Richard by her side. Even then, because of his cognitive limitations, Philip did not realize that Emmy did not exist. He simply assumed that his girlfriend and his friend had shown up at the same place by coincidence. While he felt upset that Emmy had not come, Isabella and Richard secretly laughed at him. They were amused by how easily they could deceive him. To make things worse, they took advantage of the situation and had him buy their drinks all evening. This cruel setup did not happen just once. On several occasions, Emmy arranged to meet Philip and failed to appear, yet Isabella and Richard always happened to be there. Each time, Philip's distress grew. He truly believed he was talking to Emmy, but could not understand why she constantly ignored their plans. Shockingly, this was still not the end of Isabella and Richard's schemes. Their next plan was even more malicious. By mid-May 2015, Isabella's supposed due date was approaching. Because she was naturally fuller-figured, she had no trouble convincing both men that her fake pregnancy was real. Around the middle of May 2015, Isabella asked Philip to come over to her apartment, saying she needed to have a serious talk. Philip assumed the conversation would be about the baby and agreed to meet her. He worried that she might need support because of the pregnancy. Despite everything, he remained kind-hearted and continued to believe in other people's sincerity. However, the moment he stepped inside, it became clear he had walked into another trap. Isabella and Richard were already there, waiting. They immediately took his phone and wallet and locked the door, cutting off any chance of escape. Isabella's first demand was that Philip apologize for allegedly assaulting her. He had no idea what she meant, because he had never hurt her. Normally gentle and compliant, Philip refused this time. He stood firm and would not apologize for something he had not done. Isabella became furious, shouting at him and attacking him. Soon, Richard joined in. He didn't stop at verbal threats. His aggression quickly turned physical. Isabella also became violent. She grabbed a mop and a dustpan that were within reach and began hitting Philip with them. He suffered serious injuries, and it became obvious that the pair had no intention of letting him leave peacefully. At some point, Philip managed to open a window in Isabella's bedroom. He climbed out and fled to the street, then ran toward home as fast as he could. Without his phone or wallet, he couldn't call anyone, take a bus, or get a taxi. He had no choice but to walk the entire way. Thankfully, he reached home safely. His parents refused to wait for things to get even worse. After discussing the situation with social workers, they reported the attack to the police. For reasons that were never clearly explained, law enforcement did not take the complaint seriously and failed to investigate the incident. The abuse did not end there. The next time Philip crossed paths with Isabella and Richard, the consequences would be far more tragic. Early in the morning on the 26th of May 2015, Isabella decided once again to lure Philip to her apartment. Still shaken by what had happened during his previous visit, he refused at first. In response, she resorted to a familiar, cruel tactic. She told him that Emmy, the girl he believed wanted to meet him, was waiting for him at her place. Most people would likely have sensed that something was wrong, but Philip was not like most people. He saw this as his long-awaited chance to finally meet Emmy. He and Isabella agreed to meet at a nearby shopping center, and, unsurprisingly, Richard showed up as well. All three were captured on surveillance footage, inside the store and later outside on the street. Isabella continued to insist that Emmy was at the apartment, eagerly waiting for him, and Philip eventually agreed to go. Neighbors later recalled seeing him that day. He appeared highly distressed, anxious, and frightened, while Isabella and Richard pushed him forward, urging him to hurry so as not to keep Emmy waiting. The moment Philip stepped into the apartment and the door shut behind him, Isabella and Richard immediately attacked. Once again, she demanded that he apologize for the so-called assault and insisted she would not let him leave until he said he was sorry. Philip refused to admit to something he had never done, and that refusal became the excuse Richard needed to unleash a vicious beating. Richard already had a history of violence and frequent fights, and now he claimed he was acting to defend the mother of his future child. Whether he truly believed Isabella's story didn't matter, he simply wanted a justification. He threw himself at Philip and began raining punches down on him. Isabella stood by, watching and encouraging him, thrilled at the idea that two men were supposedly fighting over her. In reality, Philip lay helpless on the floor, while Richard stood above him, striking him again and again. Wanting to preserve the moment, Isabella took out her phone and started recording. She filmed the brutal assault, and her voice can be heard in the background, urging Richard to hit harder. She felt no regret and showed not the slightest hint of sympathy for Philip. It did not matter to her that this young man had spent an entire year doing everything he could to keep her happy and comfortable. Out of pure kindness, he had given her love, attention, care, and money. Yet Isabella stood there recording as he was savagely beaten. The video lasted for more than 10 minutes, during which Philip screamed in pain and terror. Throughout the assault, Isabella and Richard kept demanding that he apologize for an attack that had never happened. Even if he had broken down and said the words they wanted to hear, it would not have stopped the violence. They did not need an apology. They needed a pretext to unleash their cruelty on someone vulnerable and defenseless. Eventually, the situation became even more extreme. Richard ran into the kitchen, grabbed a knife, and without hesitation began stabbing Philip again and again. Philip cried out in agony, but his screams only seemed to fuel Richard's rage. Despite the ferocity of the attack, Nicholson remained conscious for some time. At one point, he turned toward Isabella and, looking into the camera with a desperate expression, quietly said that he only wanted to stay friends. Philip lay on the floor, helpless and bleeding. Yet even in those final moments, his intentions were heartbreakingly pure. All he wanted was for them to remain friends. All he asked was for the violence to stop. He had already apologized many times for supposedly upsetting her and begged to be allowed to go home, but his pleas were ignored. Isabella and Richard showed no capacity for empathy. They were unmoved by his suffering. When Philip finally grew quiet, too weak to fight back or even speak, Richard stood over him and continued the torment. He muttered that no one would miss him if he disappeared, that nobody really needed him. At that point, Isabella told Richard to stab Philip one final time, and he did as she said. That last wound was fatal, and in that moment Philip Nicholson's heart stopped. Even after the brutal killing, Isabella continued filming. On the video, she and Richard can be heard calmly discussing what to do with Philip's body. The pair then settled on what they believed was a clever solution. They would stage the scene to look as though Philip had taken his own life. They clearly thought this plan would allow them to walk away without consequences. However, their actions immediately revealed the deception. They left the blood-stained knife, the murder weapon, in the kitchen sink, well away from Philip's body. In any genuine suicide, the knife would have been near the victim, not set aside. After that, Isabella and Richard simply walked out of the apartment without making the slightest effort to clean up. Their DNA and fingerprints were left everywhere, including on the knife itself. It was one of the clumsiest attempts to cover up such a brutal crime. Hand in hand, the pair walked out of the blood-soaked apartment, hugging and holding each other as if nothing had happened. They got on a bus and headed into the city, planning to enjoy a nice day together. Because the murder had taken place early in the morning, the entire day still lay ahead of them. Once they arrived in the city, something even more shocking occurred. Just minutes after taking an innocent man's life, Richard dropped to one knee and proposed to Isabella. For reasons known only to him, he seemed to think this was the perfect moment for such an important gesture. Isabella was delighted and accepted without hesitation. The rest of the day was meant to be their private celebration of the engagement. While the couple reveled in what they saw as their happy ending, they had no idea that the police were already closing in. Only minutes after Philip Nicholson's death, an emergency call had been made, most likely by a neighbor who had heard his screams. When officers arrived at Isabella's apartment, they forced the door open, rushed inside, and were met with a horrifying sight: the lifeless body of a young man. The defensive wounds on his hands and the blood-stained knife left in the kitchen sink made it immediately clear that this was not a self-inflicted injury, but a deliberate, violent attack. Investigators soon checked the building's surveillance footage. The cameras showed Philip, Richard, and Isabella entering Gosling's flat early that morning, yet only 2 people were seen leaving. This alone was enough to make Richard and Isabella the main suspects, and it did not take long for police to locate them. The newly engaged couple was arrested just a few hours after the killing, almost immediately following their twisted celebration. Richard Moore did not try to hide his role in what happened. He admitted his involvement in the murder right away and confessed to his actions. Isabella Gosling, however, had no intention of taking responsibility. She was not about to ruin her life over, as she saw it, some guy. From the beginning, she tried to shift all the blame onto Richard, her own fiancé, the man she had agreed to marry barely half an hour earlier. Isabella told investigators that Philip had come over for a simple, friendly visit, and that everything had been fine until Richard suddenly flew into a rage and stabbed him. She insisted she had been too frightened to step in or stop the attack. When police examined her phone, however, they discovered a 17-minute recording. The footage showed that, although Richard was the one physically stabbing Philip and delivering the fatal blows, Isabella could clearly be heard behind the camera, directing him and pushing him to strike again. That video alone was enough to justify charging Isabella Gosling as well. Unlike Richard, who admitted what he had done, Isabella refused to plead guilty and went to trial. During the hearings, she made a series of bizarre claims in an attempt to excuse her behavior. She said she now saw ghosts and that Philip's spirit had appeared to her, supposedly angry only with Richard and insisting that Isabella was innocent. No one in the courtroom took these stories seriously. It was also during the trial that the truth about the fake pregnancy emerged, and Richard realized he had been manipulated too. In the end, the court found Isabella Gosling guilty of causing the death of Philip Nicholson. She received a life sentence and must serve at least 19 years before she can even be considered for parole. Richard Moore, who admitted what he had done, did not face a full trial. He was also given a life sentence with a minimum term of 22 years in prison. Philip's devastated parents later condemned the poor support their son had received from social services and the police. An official review highlighted many serious failures in how the responsible agencies had protected and cared for Philip. For the Nicholson family, the most painful truth was knowing that their son's death could likely have been avoided. Isabella and Richard had carried out a pointless, brutal crime. They took the life of a gentle, defenseless young man with a kind heart and the purest intentions, someone who believed people were good and only wanted a chance at independence. He wanted friends, love, and a family of his own. Their exact motives were never fully understood. In the end, Isabella and Richard appeared to be nothing more than cruel, empty-hearted individuals who took pleasure in tormenting the vulnerable. There seems to be no other way to interpret what happened. Isabella was clearly the driving force behind this crime. She deliberately turned the two men against each other, inventing a pregnancy and falsely accusing one of them of assault. Richard accepted her lies and believed he was protecting the honor of the supposed mother of his child, though that can never excuse what he did. Without Isabella's influence, Philip would almost certainly still be alive. Despite what Richard told Philip before killing him, that nobody would miss him, that he was not needed, none of it was true. This young man was special, not because of any intellectual ability, but because of his kindness and his pure, unspoiled heart. His life ended far too early. He was only 22 years old. Those who knew him remember Philip as extraordinarily kind, caring, and generous. In contrast, very few people wish to remember Richard and Isabella at all. If you have stayed with this story to the end, you are clearly a dedicated true crime viewer. Consider subscribing to the channel, turning on notifications, and leaving a like to support more stories like this. Until next time.